positions have been given to each side. This particular topic has been given, assigned to the schools, and they've been told which side they need to defend. These views that they're speaking about do not represent their own opinions or the schools that they're representing's opinions necessarily. The motion today is this House believes that identity politics are a net negative to minority groups and to the country as a whole. We've got Nish over here on the UCLA side. He's going to start as the Prime Minister. Brendan is over for USC. Then we'll come back to Philip, who is representing UCLA. Mira from USC from USC is going to do the response for USC's side. We'll come back to Nish. Is going to do that. You didn't get that in here. Nish is going to do the final rebuttal for UCLA, and then Matthew is going to finally wrap up for USC. So one more time, these positions are assigned to these students and don't represent their views necessarily or their schools. The position that they are defending on UCLA's side is the following. This House believes that identity politics are a net negative to minority groups and to the country as a whole. We'll go ahead and give 6 minutes to Nish from UCLA.
Hello. Hey, look, Mom, I'm on TV. Ladies and gentlemen, admittedly, when I came to the United States 4 years ago, it was to make it as a rock star in Hollywood. So far, so good. There's Clay Aiken. Oh my God, we're on stage together. I made it. But more than that, it was because I was allured by the idea of America as a land of individuality. Philosophically, the political wisdom of America for centuries on end has been a championing of the rights of an individual to self-define themselves in their own way, to self-actualize in ways that are unique or meaningful to them. This is the pursuit of happiness prescribed as a philosophical right to each individual. We think identity politics, as it has appeared in the media of America today, is a mutual or antithetical to that process of self-determination. But before we begin, let's just take a quick look at where we are in the world. There are minority groups all around America who continue to face grievous oppression, and though a lot of advocacy has been done in the past few years, we have to confront the sad reality that very little has actually been achieved, and for a lot of these minorities, things are still as bad as they always were. Necessarily then, the team that will win this debate is the team that can prove which world is better for these minorities and improves lives for them. And by that we mean the team that can prove actual, tangible policy reform or change that incrementally makes lives better for minority groups. The claim you're going to get from government or proposition is to tell you that identity politics distracts from the effort of minorities gaining political traction, and it's bad for America on a philosophical level. So what is identity politics? We say, forming an identity is a positive and important thing. In fact, it's the first thing that you have to do in forming a meaningful life for yourself. Identity politics, though, is a very different thing. That's conducting political activity or entering the marketplace and using identity as a means to an end, the end being certain political goals. The culture of identity politics, especially as it's seen in the media, has led to one where being a black male means that I am associated to a certain set of political ideals and ideas that function effectively as stereotypes. Being a transgender individual in the LGBT community means I must therefore align myself with certain things. We think this is very harmful for a variety of reasons. The first way that this can be harmful is that identity politics creates a set of associated ideas and political agendas that an individual is locked into based on very arbitrary things that you usually cannot change, like the color of your skin or your sexual preference. This co-opts the ability of an individual to self-decide for themselves what they might want to identify with. For instance, identity politics is an emergent property. So the identity of the African-American male in America is an emergent property that arose from collectivizing African-Americans and saying generally all their concerns are the same, and therefore we can create the stereotype that the African-American male is going to probably vote left. They're going to probably be a Democrat voter. And for any African-American male that decides that they might not align with ideals of the left, they have a difficulty conceptualizing of that identity because what the marketplace of prescribed identities tells them is that they cannot do that. A member of the LGBT might not believe in the narrative that born this way is the best articulation of their identity. And the LGBT campaign, through various points of its existence, has championed that narrative. For these individuals, their right to self-determine is co-opted by collective entities that tell them what they should and should not be feeling. Often,
doesn't that imply that people don't have the ability to make a decision for themselves? That if I am a black female, that I cannot make a decision for myself as to what I believe because you're saying society is choosing for me, but that takes away my own power, doesn't it?
Exactly, that's the problem. So,
But that implies that I don't have the ability to make a decision for myself.
but you do. So there are two choices that you have here. And I'll get to the second one. This is the instance where, because you need a sense of comfort and belonging, you are tempted to say, I belong to the LGBT. Even if I might not believe in, agree on all their principles, I agree on some of them, enough for me to sacrifice the ones that I might not agree with and just link up anyway. We think that's harmful for a variety of reasons. The second reason why it's harmful beyond a philosophical level of co-opting your ability to choose for yourself, and I'll talk about why opting out is a harm later. The second harm is that oftentimes you lose a lot of the nuance of intersectionality. So identity politics framing Asian people or Indian people as model minorities is very dangerous for the swaths of people who aren't represented by that identity. For instance, I can't walk around in San Francisco, Palo Alto without somebody asking me who I code for. Can't do computer stuff. But there are swaths of brown people and Asian people in parts of America that are incredibly poor, but the identity of being model minorities that usually play violin and do very well in the economy means that we forget the concerns of all those people. Now, let's get back to the question over here. Let's assume you do decide to choose for yourself. Let's say you are an African American male and you actually decide not to vote left and be a Republican instead. This, we argue, is far worse because the courage that you have taken to step outside often pits you as a traitor to that community. The rest of the people who do buy into the assuaged feeling of being in a comfortable collective will point at you and say that you are not a real African American and you are a traitor. We have numerous examples of this. For instance, the moment Clarence Thomas decided when we got Chief Justice position, it was more important to African American communities that this was a black Republican or a black conservative than that this was a black individual finally ascending to a place of power. So while it was important that now we had an African American as a Chief Justice, it was the real barriers of success, barriers of entry to success was set up with the African American community and the Democrat community that for the longest time championed the narrative that they wanted this sort of change to happen. We think those are exactly the instances in which when an individual opts out, they're seen as traitors and are forced to go up against a lot of backlash from the communities that purportedly are there to protect them. The final harm from identity politics, of my speech at least, is going to argue to you that a lot of politicians, understanding that identity can be weaponized, do so. For instance, I'm probably more Cherokee than Elizabeth Warren, but because it's very strategic for politicians to gain the attention of sensationalist media in the way, they take identity, a very personal and intrinsic process, and weaponize it in public discourse. What that means is you get individuals who are not connected to the struggles of the identity that they claim to be, and end up being a misrepresentation of those people on the ground. We say underrepresentation is preferable to misrepresentation because it takes centuries to undo that. Identity is intrinsic and personal. Don't let the political sphere take it away from you. We are so proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Nish. We'll move over to, I don't know, Brendan from USC to make the statement for the opposition.
Hello. Awesome. I stand here against this motion because a couple of reasons. I believe that identity politics is the best way to address issues that face minority groups today. And as a result, I believe that a world without identity politics fails to address those pressing issues not only for everyone, but for minority groups especially. Now let's address some of government's arguments. They conflate identity politics with stereotypes. These aren't the same thing. Saying that someone, because they're an Indian American, must know how to code isn't the same thing as identity politics, which is politics that is fundamentally based on your identity. Identity politics is where you are acting what is in the self-interest of your identity group. So you act on the issues that affect your identity group first and foremost. Now, the core of their argument is that because this is something that takes place, that is somehow oppressive, that these issues affect you and that you're bound to take a certain stance. But that's not oppressive. You still have the ability to choose how you feel about certain issues. And if anything is oppressive, it's the oppressive structures that exist that force you to take specific stances. Thus, if anything, we ought to address oppression in America, such as the disproportionate police killings of Black Americans, rather than talk about identity politics as something that is somehow oppressive. It's not. The things that are oppressive are those that are forcing specific groups to take specific stances because that is what affects them.
Or would you make the argument then that all African Americans believe that killings of African Americans by police officers is a #1 priority?
No, I don't think that a whole group believes a specific thing. What I think is that it's perfectly fine for groups in America to act politically as into what is in their own identity group's self-interest. And that's what I'm all right with today. And because I think that's the best way to address issues that affect minority groups, that's why we should oppose this motion. So why exactly is that true? Why exactly is identity politics necessary to address the issues affecting minority groups today? Because no one else addresses it. Sure.
So it was in the interest of the Asian American community to present themselves as model minorities, but usually that's an emergent interest. What about the individuals in the Asian American communities that might not align with that greater interest? How do you get individualism on your side?
I think there are plenty of things that affects individuals' identity and prevents them from being truly, truly free without any sort of external factor affecting their identity. I don't think that impact coming from your side is very significant in today's debate. That being said, why is it true that identity politics are necessary? First of all, no one else is addressing these issues. People are inherently self-interested in what they pay attention to, right? So I'm really interested in politics. I read 538 every day, right? But I only do that because I'm interested in it. I enjoy reading about those things. I don't read things that I'm not interested in. Likewise, we are interested in things that affect our identity. Thus, white Americans, which make up a majority of America, aren't specifically interested in issues that affect minority groups because it doesn't affect their self-interest. Thus, they're less likely to be aware of it. Thus, in a world without identity politics, without identity groups advocating and raising awareness about specific issues, we don't have this sort of awareness society-wide. Because we have groups that are not listening to the issues of minorities simply because it's not their self-interested awareness. Furthermore, we can see that identity groups or identity politics is necessary because it turns minority issues into crisis issues. So what takes place in a world without identity politics? Well, we see that minority issues don't become crisis issues for elites in society. Now, it's inherently true that issues that affect minorities simply affect less people than everyone else, right? That's what it means to be a minority. Thus, as a result, they're considered less important issues by society writ large. How do we address this? Well, we address this by identity politics, identity groups, turning these issues into crisis issues for elites and raising awareness about them to the media at large.
Question, sir?
No, thank you. So, how does that exactly work? Well, if you look to, say, Martin Luther King's bus boycotts, he turned an issue which affected Black Americans into a crisis issue for everyone else. By boycotting the bus system, he made it so elites were paying the cost of issues that affected Black Americans. Because now the transportation system was losing money from not having tickets from Black Americans going on it, it made it a crisis issue for society at large. No, thank you. As a result, that meant that elites in society, which were now being harmed by the realities of identity politics that were raising this into a crisis issue, had to address it. Thus, we can see that one of the best ways to turn an issue that affects minority groups into a crisis issue that elites have to address is by having identity politics and identity groups addressing those issues and raising them into a crisis issue through fervent activism and fervent protest. Furthermore, we can see that this helps bring in allies. So in a world without identity groups, right, someone might want to advocate for issues that affect minorities. But the problem is, without identity groups that are so fervently being activists for a specific issue, how do I know what to advocate for or what's in the self-interest of these minority groups, right? How do I know, if there aren't immigration groups advocating for interest of immigrants in America, how do I know as an ally who I should be advocating for what issues are most important? By raising awareness of these issues at large, we're able to make it so everyone in society can address issues specific to minority groups.
Time.
Yes.
So
Time.
who in the
We're gonna have to
minority?
call time on this right now. Thank you very much to to y'all. What school? To USC and to Brendan for that. We're going to move over to Philip and UCLA for the response.
I thought it was really bizarre when we were told about this thought experiment of a world that existed outside of identity politics. I actually don't think that exists, and to try and envision a world in which people don't identify with a particular group is kind of absurd, because that's not really the debate at heart. Nish and I aren't trying to tell you that identifying with a group is bad unequivocally all the time. This is a very, very specific debate. Has identity politics been leveraged properly in the United States as it is right now? Does identifying with a group make coalitions more inclusive? Does it rally people to causes, or does it alienate them by having strong tribal exclusion, which is the kind of thing that derails political action in the first place? And that's what we need to be thinking about. There's plenty of examples that can attest to this. One of the things we just heard was about the idea of, fostering allies and getting more political support. But identity politics in the United States is a little more complicated than that. It seems to be a set of rules where there's a focal point of guilt. There's a demographic that causes the suffering of other demographics in the country, and the whole point is to stay as far away from that point as possible. And I think no example could be more eminent than when Hillary Clinton, during her campaign speech, referred to every single Trump voter as quote-unquote a basket of deplorables. I'm not saying that you should agree with Trump. By no means am I asking you to be Republican if you aren't already, but I need you to think about what that implies. It implies that there's a group of people, because they've identified with the left or the right, that have segregated themselves from a different group and ascribed all of their actions to their race. The assumption that every single person who voted for Trump did so because they were a neo-Nazi, which would turn the United States into the largest recreation of Wolfenstein on the planet. It's terrifying because it's not true. People in the Rust Belt didn't vote for Trump because they woke up one day and decided they were fascists. There's a host of economic problems that plagues the Rust Belt. There's nothing particularly redeeming about West Virginia except that it got, mentioned in a John Denver song? Like, what was it, Country Roads? That's the problem. It's these economic problems that plague the kinds of people who turn red, but the real problem of identity politics is that because they were explained away as being racist, none of those economic issues are ever going to get solved. There was no political mobilization for Trump, for people who voted for Trump to try and revitalize the Rust Belt. There was no reason to ameliorate the economic situation that plagued the Midwest because we didn't think of that as the reason why Trump got so much support. It was explained away by the identity politics, the first presumption that these people voted entirely on race. That's the problem of the point about allies. That's the problem of saying that identity politics gets you allies. We say that A, it doesn't, it just alienates the other side, but B, most importantly, there's a whole host of economic issues that gets ignored because of the reasons you ascribe to people's behavior.
Wouldn't the argument be made, though, that that comment and that alienation of that particular group did galvanize support on the other side, too? I mean, those folks who agreed with the basket of deplorables comment, were they not more galvanized together to support for Hillary Clinton? I understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, that it certainly alienates a certain group of people who felt like they did not want to be called deplorables, but did it not in some way make other folks and other groups feel as if though they had somebody who supported them?
But Clay, that's the problem. It's not about how hard you can galvanize a group of people by, raising the war cry of deplorables. It's about meaningful changes to the country's economy. If all it takes for Hillary Clinton to make people think that she's going to be a change for the world is to talk about how much she dislikes Trump voters and leave it at that, the bottom line is, sure, there's a bigger resistance, but what does that resistance mean? Does it put better food on your table? Does it change the amount of income you make? At the end of the day, these people are worse off because they've been described as deplorable and no amount of policy resources need to go to them. Like, you can be a Democrat, that's fine. I don't disagree with that. We can differ politically, but the bottom line about America is you need some level of humanity and an understanding of humanity. That even if someone else is Republican, bottom line, they should be able to make a living wage, right?
As a white man, do you think that you're able to really understand what it's like to need that support that minority groups feel that they need, and that sense of community and that sense of advocacy? Do you think that you're able to understand that as a white man?
I'm really glad you asked that, because the bottom line is what brings us back to Martin Luther King. I think the problem with hailing Martin Luther King as like a good example of identity politics is that Martin Luther King didn't use identity politics. If you listen to his most famous speech, I Have a Dream, it was a broad universalist approach to the place of Black Americans in America's greater social fabric, right? It wasn't about a separate enclave that claimed that white people will never understand the plight of the Black man. It was never about that. It was about, one, about a Christian concept of forgiveness, and two, being able to integrate. That's not what the moral fabric of America looks like today, Clay. There's a social justice movement pushing for separate graduation ceremonies for African Americans. That's like the biggest 180 we've done, all under the banner of identity politics, that Black people need their own space and they should be exempt and opt out of greater American society. That's the bigger issue. There's no economic change that way. There's no social change. And actually, I want to talk about the rhetoric regarding Ferguson and body cameras and police brutality while I have time. The problem is that if any legislative action was taken from Ferguson, it was in spite of identity politics and not because of it, because so much media time was focused on sensationalizing those issues. And I really have a question for USC. When you say that it creates urgency for social issues for a particular group, who picks those issues? Who's in charge of making that decision, and what kind of issues do you obscure by doing so? We spend so much media time talking about whether or not the police were an institution of white supremacy in a state with a bunch of black law enforcement officials. Like, even if the conclusion was, okay, the police is staffed by a bunch of neo-Nazis, so what? The American government doesn't respond to those things. The levers of government don't bend when you call them racist. They bend when you go to the voting booth and when you make laws that change the way that police have to act towards people. Having a discussion about how fascist they are didn't do any good. It was the people who mobilized a broad coalition of voters who appealed to a universalist image of America, the same way that Bill Clinton did and the same way that Ronald Reagan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Philip. Yep. All right. Now we'll move on to Mira from USC to respond to the opposition.
All right, just before I go into a couple more points of positive matter, I'm going to talk about what the opening government has come up here and talked about. So one of their main arguments was this idea that a set of associated ideas is going to be harmful to the voter base and to legislation, etc. The problem is we don't think that stereotypes are unique to identity politics. We don't think that in a world where identity politics don't exist, we're going to get rid of this grouping of people, right? So at the point where we see a problem of people not being advocated for and people basically being subverted in the legislative process, we think that identity politics is the key to solving this problem. Now, they also talk about this idea of backlash, right? But I think that if you looked at how backlash occurs in the legislative process or in the voter base, we think that identity politics is, one, not the cause of it, and two, like, arguably something that could be disassociated, right? We think that backlash is going to occur a lot worse when people are going to be continued to be misrepresented or underheard. Now, additionally, they talk about how identity can be weaponized, right? We think that if we look to just simply the negative examples of identity politics, it's going to be infinitely regressive in terms of making policy change. We think that looking at this very pessimistic, almost regressionist view is not what the current government should be doing in terms of solving the issues of systemic oppression and discrimination that exist in the status quo. Now, also, they talk about this idea of how white voters, or specifically white male voters, are starting to associate more with their own identities and how that in itself is a net harm. I'll get to you right after this. We think that the reason why this is happening isn't necessarily because of the institution of identity politics, but rather the idea and the fear of demographic change. We think that this fear that has been instilled in this particular voter base or particular demographic is what is actually causing this over-association with their group. I can take your question.
So who decides what the LGBT community stands for? Is usually the people that are organizing LA Pride or San Francisco Pride. And usually those are the people that are running the website and stuff. If I don't agree with those things, as a member of the LGBT community, what do I do? Do I go off and start a separate faction? Do I just join them anyway? How do I get my political change?
I think you have the ability to be a part of that particular movement, even if their platform is not identical to yours. I think you have the freedom to advocate for your own platform within that movement. While it may not be widely advertised under their own name or their banner or whatever it is, I think that you having a different ideology that is still grouped under a particular end policy goal, I think that you have that ability within America currently. Now, going into my point of positive matter, which is this idea that identity politics eliminates the arguments of co-option, right? We think that a lot of the reasons why identity politics gets a bad name currently is because we see that people are associating with groups that are either supporting egregious things, or people who are not part of a particular demographic are advocating incorrectly for others. We think that supporting identity politics allows for a more accepting view of it in the general population. And we think that that's only going to happen when we actually think of identity politics as a valid way to further your political goals or further like legislative action. I will get to you after this. Additionally, we can look to like the very large like amounts of progress that have actually been made through ID politics, right? We look to things such as criminal justice reform that has been almost entirely progressed because of things like the Black Lives Matter movement or the like solving of issues such as body cameras, right? Additionally, look to...
Can you give any example of a criminal justice issue that's been addressed because of Black Lives Matter?
I think that the idea that there is a recurring overpopulation of prisons by minority groups was something that was raised, like this issue was raised specifically by members of the Black Lives Matter movement.
And has it been addressed?
I think that we have made more progress in addressing this issue in the last couple of years than we have in a long time. Additionally, look to this idea of an ulterior motive question. We think that in a world without identity politics, or one where identity politics isn't considered a valid way to further your political goals, we think that we see a question of what is the ulterior motive. We think that people who are going to be advocating for minority groups, the like select few that might, are going to be posed the question of why are you doing this? Because there has to be a reason that is beyond the like your desire to actually give minorities a voice. And we think that the inclusion of identity politics is an exceptional, like as a acceptable way to conduct politics and conduct your voting is a way to solve for this, yeah.
Okay, so one of the big deals in the 70s and 80s with the LGBT community was an entire discussion about whether bisexual people can be part of that group, like that cementing of time and resources, just excluding a bunch of other people. What political goal did that accomplish?
We think that the idea that identity politics is a thing allows for discussion to break through those barriers. We think that in a world where we don't have ID politics that don't allow for such discussions is going to be arguably a lot worse for our political sphere as well as decision making than it would be without ID politics. So for all of these reasons, I strongly urge an opposition vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mira. We'll head back over here to Nish for the final rebuttal from UCLA.
When Christina Hoff Sommers decided that she wanted to argue that a wage gap doesn't exist, she was lambasted by feminists for doing this. She received death threats on Twitter because for some reason her politics were different from those prescribed to her identity. Make no mistake, identity politics is a war, and it is a war waged in the arenas of the internet and the arenas of the media.
Was she lambasted because of she didn't subscribe to the same identity, the same politics of her gender, or was she lambasted because what she was disagreeing was a tangible and provable fact that she wasn't correct about?
Right. It's in fact the first thing that you suggested, because the fact that males who identify as feminists have been critiquing feminism for a while was okay. It was worse for feminists to see a woman say those things, and it was her identity that pigeonholed her into supporting a philosophy.
But isn't it hard to make that argument when something is tangible and provable? If she's arguing that a wage gap doesn't exist and it's tangibly provable that one does, how can you say that she was being lambasted because she was a woman instead of because she had facts wrong?
So it perhaps could be both of those things. But I think the Twitter response that we saw was one that called her out for being a woman who supported things that women ought not support. It wasn't the fact that she was lambasted, it was the optics of the situation. In fact, we're not saying identity is bad, we're saying the optics of identity politics is very dangerous. The three broad claims we get on this side is minority issues don't get addressed. So the only way to address them is identity politics. We say who decides what the most pressing issue is, as Clay pointed out in the POI, is often the problem we have with identity politics. Because it assumes that the overarching issue that the entire group, that the group is pressing for is the issue that everybody wants to accomplish. So even if you do accomplish that issue in a moment, what ends up happening is the public at large is assuaged that the LGBT community got what it wants, even though minorities within those minorities might not get what they want.
But how does that not address, I'm sorry Matthew, let me get this wrong. How does that not address, I mean that's advocacy groups, is that not any different than advocacy groups? It sounds like you're saying we don't need these advocacy groups. As a gay man myself, I may not agree with every single thing that GLSEN or GLAAD or HRC says, but I appreciate, and your question is, are a net negative.
Exactly.
I do believe that though I don't agree with everything they say, that they still provide a net positive for LGBT.
Right. And as an advocacy group, that's a lot better because you can decide that you're going to team up with like-minded individuals on an issue, but not an identity. So an advocacy group based on identity pigeonholes you into the things that identity tells you should want. But as an advocacy group outside of the realm of identity politics, you're more likely to get traction for your own individual issues without being forced to take on the battles that you don't necessarily want to win for the LGBT. For instance, a member of the same community, I don't agree with the Born This Way campaign, but if I do so, like I pointed out in my speech, I'm singled out as a traitor to that community, like Christina Hoff Summers were. The second claim that they want to present to you is that we turn these things into crisis issues, and that's the only way to get people thinking about the issues of minorities. We think this is incredibly harmful, because turning things into crisis issues is when the media starts to sensationalize things and abstract things such that you don't get actual policy change. Remember that on our team, what we want is tangible change. When the riots in Ferguson broke out, it should have been a discussion about law enforcement. How maybe body cameras is something that we should talk about. How do we get redress against cops that commit felonies or injustices against individuals? Instead, a sensationalist media that makes money off of getting a riot out of people chose to frame this narrative as white privilege and institutionalized privilege versus systematic, institutionalized, like slave mentality, awful things. These are important things to talk about in a moment, sir. These are very important things to talk about, but in talking about them, the discussion strayed away from the discussion we should have been having, which is the discussion about law enforcement. So when we talk about this vague idea of like some progress was made, I'm not buying it because I'm not really sure which progress they're pointing at insofar as no actual change has been made in the structure of how police. So we think that's a problem where identity politics leads you to talk about things that are sensationalist and not about things that you can actually solve. Sure.
Yes, so I think it's pretty clear that it requires a crisis issue to address these things. At the point where House members are elected every 2 years, they simply have no incentive to address long-term issues. Look to the US federal debt. Look to climate change. All of these are issues which are long-term, which don't get addressed. What do get addressed are short-term issues which people think are political crises.
Yeah. So it is true that there are issues that people need to address, but using identity politics as a means to addressing those issues is far worse for the needs of minorities that might not agree that those issues are the most important to be addressed. The worst thing is it assuages people to believe that they are.
So you're saying it's a net negative for specific people who don't agree, but your question is net negative to minority groups and the country as a whole.
Exactly.
And you're specifically saying here to me and to everyone that identity politics is negative for those individuals who don't happen to agree with the minority group. That's not necessarily what the question is, though, is it?
Right. So that's the first level of what I'm saying, and the second level of what I'm saying is the deeper philosophical analysis that your ability to conceptualize your own identity is co-opted insofar as you're often prescribed identities by the media. So for America as a philosophical entity, your political wisdom should uphold the ability of me to decide what issues are based on my own preferences and be allowed to be female and anti-wage gap, or black and anti-left. But I'm not allowed to do that because of the narratives that you progress. What I want to conclude with is, like all the yogis of the East, I want to echo this sentiment. America needs to turn off their politicized, polarized, sensationalist media and look inward for a more organic process of deciding who they are.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nish and UCLA. Matthew, sorry you didn't get your question in, but you do get the last word. So Matthew from USC with 5-minute opposition rebuttal.
Okay, there's one thing that throughout this debate has been missed, and it's what identity politics actually is. Now, all they bring up and all that we've been talking about is just race, but identity is something much more than that. It's who you are as a person. It's your likes, your preferences. It's the holistic analysis of what makes you a person. And this is what they fundamentally misunderstand, which is going to be bad for them in this debate, because we need to talk about identity politics and the actual impact it has to our society. We have to be talking about this idea of a net good, and we have to be talking about what the tangible impacts are. They give you none. But let's ask 3 questions that are going to be extremely important to this debate. The first question is, what is identity politics? And I already told you before, it makes up so much more than what they want to talk about. Identity politics is a much bigger scope than what they're actually bringing to the table. What we're focusing on in today's debate is how it affects minorities. Not just their race, not just their skin color, but every single thing that makes up a minority. We must be paying attention to this, and we must be considering this when we look at the tangible effects and what actually happens when we have certain identity groups forming. And what we tell you is that these identity groups are crucial for social change, because when people see I have common interests with another, and when I have a common interest with him, we struggle the same way, we have the same shared experiences, then we can come together, figure out what the problem is, and come to a better solution. I'll take your question.
The LGBT community spent years deciding who was part of the in-group and who was part of the out-group. That's time and resources that could have been spent advocating. In Ferguson, we talked about overarching issues that couldn't get
I'm
tangible
glad you
solutions.
brought up the LGBT community because this is a perfect example of why identity politics is crucial to creating social change. The LGBT community, when you had identity politics, you had a conversation being started in the first place. It was being brought to the table. Identity politics is what brought that to the forefront. In their world, what we have to keep in mind is, in a world without identity politics, it would have never been to the discussion table. We would not have been talking about whether or not bis and transgenders and other people who are in the LGBT community are being subjected to oppression in our current structural system. We would have never came to that conversation, and that's what you have to understand. Now, the second question I want to ask is this. Are these examples that they bring up of stereotypes, is that actually identity politics? And no, it's not. What he brings up, every single example, in fact, they bring up are examples of stereotypes, but that is not what identity politics is. Identity politics is the idea of conforming with another person or group based on shared interests and identities, and then creating social change as a result of that. They haven't really interacted with this. They just told you that stereotypes are bad. Of course I know stereotypes are bad. And the example of him going on the street and people like saying bad things about him, of course that's a bad thing, but that is not what identity politics is. What we have to realize is that they give you no net harm that identity politics has brought to the table in society. At the point where they can't prove to you a single tangible harm, there's no reason you should vote for them because we give you a list of them on our side. But the third and final question, which is what leads into this, is going to be the idea of what creates net good and what creates net harm. Just look at the table and look at the balance sheet as it is right now. We already have given you two examples. The LGBT community being able to mobilize as a form of identity politics, people identifying with each other and going on these pride marches, going out there and standing up for what they believe in. That is identity politics, and that led to the legalization of gay marriage, which is a huge, monumental impact for these minorities. We have to pay attention to that. That's not only one example. The other example we give you is the Black Lives Matter movement. If you didn't have identity politics, you would not have had African Americans assemble together and go out and march in the streets. As a result, sure, the change is not what we want to see right now, but we have seen change. Over 2,000 different police stations have now incorporated body cameras into every single one of their officers. This is monumental change because you have to start small. You don't start by going big and just by looking at this example so isolated. You need to look at the future prospects and what we'll actually bring to the table because we're able to get together and form social cohesion. Now, let's move on to some more points.
Points up.
Sure, I'll take your point.
The American legal system says it's okay that 10 people go guilty, guilty people go free as long as one innocent person doesn't get caught. Sometimes the needs of the many can sacrifice the needs of the few. Are you okay with making that calculus for some greater good if me as an LGBT person is uniquely harmed?
Here's my response in the context of the debate. Okay, all identity politics is, and this debate is about, it's not about race versus, it's not about whites versus blacks, it's not about all these things. It's about the oppressor versus the oppressed. And this is the key thing. If we don't have identity politics, you don't have the oppressed get up and go and identify with other people and form these groups in order to say we're oppressed and be able to diagnose the problem. In their world, what they'll tell you is that we should just ignore both because we're listening to the oppressor because the oppressor is going to get mad. That's not how you create social change. When you listen to that, the only way you're going to create social change is by listening to us because we tell you identity politics is how we create this change. Now, the final point I'm going to be going over and the final question today is who actually creates this idea of net harm. Not only have we given you these consistent examples, but what you have to realize is that they've never given you a single tangible good from anything else. My question is this: if identity politics doesn't work, then what does? What works? What is going to bring discussion to the table? We've already proven to you why identity politics brings certain issues that uniquely affect minorities, why it brings it to the spotlight. We've showed you that that happens. At the point where in our world, we get actual discussion. In their world, you get absolutely nothing.
Thank you
and
very
for all
much.
these reasons, I strongly believe that
Thank you
identity
very much,
politics-
Matthew. Thank you very much, UCLA. Thank you much, USC. Really quickly, we're gonna real quick time crunch. I don't know. Yes, thank you. Really quickly, I want to make a quick few questions for you, and now I've forgotten what they are. I want to ask you the same question that I asked the last group. Is there a wording of this question that would have changed your argument and made it different, or stronger, or harder, or easier?
You know, wording of the
Wording
motion?
of the motion, sorry.
Yeah, I think it would be identity politics does net harm to America as a political system or a philosophical political entity.
Okay.
And that, I think, might have been more in line.
What about you guys?
I think it was pretty interesting that the affirmative or the proposition was the world that we currently, analyzing the world that we currently live in, because generally the proposition is analyzing a hypothetical world where you would put something into action. I think that wording was a little bit strange.
So you think that currently we live in a world where identity politics are an issue?
I think that the way that they are presented is an issue.
So you think the term identity politics is a hot button term? It's a bad word?
I think that the way that like identity politics are actually, I guess like the word that he used was optics. I think that the current optics of identity politics have a very negative connotation.
Okay, so that right there is my biggest issue with your argument. You had a phrasing of this motion that included a really negative term, identity politics, right? And what do we see both political parties doing when there's a hot button issue with a term that they don't like? People don't like Obamacare, so we call it Affordable Care Act, right? And we change the term and therefore take some of that heat off of the way people see it. You had a real opportunity there to not use such a hot button negative term, to not use the phrase identity politics. And I don't know what you could have called it or would have called it, but had you called it something else, then every time you said the word identity politics, wouldn't feel like you were fighting against something that universally we all don't like. You see what I'm saying? I think your arguments were potentially in places stronger than some of theirs, because you made the argument that advocacy and strengths in numbers was powerful and important, right? And I think those were really, really strong arguments. But every time you talked about that, you called it identity politics. You tried to make the argument that the word identity politics was a positive, instead of the effect of identity politics, which is advocacy. I'm not going to come up with a name right now because I can't, but had you called it something like advocacy politics, maybe that would have changed the tone of it. You understand what I'm saying? So that was a missed opportunity, I think, for you guys. I love that you were up and around like a preacher. You were here last year, so you're familiar with the judge, and that I like that. You got to slow it down a little bit. You got to slow it down a little bit when you talk, but it's very good that they weren't on their paper as much, and it's more convincing when you're not on the paper. You weren't on your paper as much, Brendan, which was great. I'm going to give it to UCLA because I can't help but appreciate the fact that I tried to throw some really hard questions at you, and you came back at me with answers that I didn't expect.
They were good, Clay.
Oh, well, I appreciate the ass kissing. Not necessarily anymore. You already tried it. You already won. But I really thought you guys had some really good arguments. But like the last group, the last group that was up here, and the idea of trying to reframe the argument. The last group that was up here, they reframed an argument in a way that really, I'm sorry, I guess it was the first one today, reframed the argument in a way that made me want to side with them, even though I didn't win because I had other judges here with me. But reframing that argument, I think, was something that you guys probably could have done that would have helped. But either way, incredible teams, UCLA, USC, give them a round of applause. Thank you guys very much.